I stood in the freezing mud while the Alpha King placed the crown of winter hemlock on my sister's head. It was supposed to be mine. We were blood, but Clara was the sun, and I was the dirt she walked on. When Kaelin looked right through me and declared her his Luna, I didn't scream. I just learned to survive the cold. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor. My true mate wasn't a king. He was a monster, forged in blood, and he had finally arrived. The great hall of Valerius Keep smelled of roasting boar, stale ale, and the overwhelming musk of 400 wolves crammed into one space. It was the winter solstice, the night the Alpha King was to announce his Luna. For 3 years I had stood at Kaelin's right hand. I fought in his skirmishes in the mud of the lowlands. I stitched the spear wound in his shoulder when the northern rogues ambushed our hunting party. We didn't have a fiery, destiny-written mate bond, but we had something I thought was stronger. We had respect. We had an understanding forged over maps and blood-soaked snow. He needed a general, a partner who understood the brutal arithmetic of keeping a pack alive through the long freeze. He had pressed his forehead to mine just 3 nights ago in the armory, his hands smelling of oil and steel, and told me I was the spine of his reign. But respect is a poor substitute for lust. I stood by the massive hearth, the heat baking the wool of my tunic. My sister Clara sat at the high table. She didn't fight. She didn't hunt. While I was pulling frost-bitten hounds from bear traps, Clara was in the southern manors, learning the lute and wearing silks that cost more than a family's winter grain ration. She had returned a month ago, a political maneuver by our father to consolidate his influence. Clara was radiant. Her hair was the color of spun copper, her skin unblemished by the harsh northern winds. The drumming started. Low, rhythmic thumps of fist against oak tables. The pack was calling for the ceremony. Kaelin stood up. He was a massive man, broad-shouldered, wearing the heavy bear fur mantle of the Alpha. His eyes, a pale, startling amber, swept over the room. The crowd fell dead silent. The only sound was the crackle and spit of the logs in the hearth. My chest tightened. A dull, rhythmic pressure pushed against my ribs. I smoothed the rough fabric of my dark trousers and prepared to step forward. We had rehearsed this. Not in words, but in the lingering touches, the shared glances across council tables. I belonged up there. Tonight, the long night reaches its peak. Kaelin's voice boomed, bouncing off the vaulted stone ceiling. And tonight, the pack needs a mother, a light in the dark, a Luna to guide our spirits when the snows bury our doors. He stepped down from the dais. The crowd parted for him like water. He walked slowly, his heavy iron-shod boots thudding against the flagstones. He was holding the hemlock crown, woven with pale winter berries, a symbol of resilience. He stopped, but not in front of me. He stood before Clara. My breathing hitched. The sound died in my throat. I stared at his broad back, waiting for the joke, waiting for him to pivot. He didn't. Clara looked up at him through her thick lashes, her cheeks flushed with a perfect, calculated innocence. She didn't look surprised. "Clara of the House of Vane," Kaelin said, his voice dropping an octave, thick with a gravelly reverence I had never heard him use with me. "I claim you as my mate. I claim you as Luna of the Northern Marches." The silence in the hall stretched. It was a taut wire, humming with tension. A few heads turned my way. The pity in their eyes burned worse than a hot brand. They knew. The whole pack knew the unspoken promise between Kaelin and me. Clara stood up. She reached out with delicate, pale hands and placed them over Kaelin's thick, scarred wrists. "I accept, my king," she murmured. He lowered the crown onto her copper hair. The pack erupted. Howls tore from their throats, shaking the dust from the rafters. Mugs of ale were slammed against the tables. They didn't care about my stitched wounds or my strategic victories. They wanted a beautiful queen. They wanted a fairy tale. Kaelin gave it to them. I didn't cry. Crying was for women who had something to lose. I had clearly already lost everything before the night even began. Kaelin turned, Clara's hand tucked firmly in the crook of his arm. His amber eyes locked onto mine across the sea of celebrating bodies. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. I saw the guilt. I saw the cowardice. He had chosen the soft, pretty lie over the hard, bloody truth. I held his gaze. I didn't flinch. I let my face go completely blank, draining every ounce of emotion from my features. I gave him a slow, mocking bow of my head. Then I turned my back on my king and my sister. I pushed through the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the biting winter air. The cold hit me like a physical blow, instantly freezing the sweat on my neck. The wind howled through the courtyard, carrying the scent of pine and approaching snow. It was better out here. The air in the hall had become toxic, suffocating. I walked toward the kennels. The hounds whined as I approached, sensing the shift in my scent. I sank to the freezing straw beside my lead hunting dog, a massive, scarred brute named Brutus. He rested his heavy, warm head on my knee. I buried my hands in his thick fur and stared out into the dark tree line. The betrayal didn't feel like a broken heart. It felt like a broken jaw, a dull, throbbing ache that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. Kaelin had taken my loyalty and traded it for soft skin and a sweet smile. Let them have their feast. Let them have their radiant Luna. Winter was coming, and a hemlock crown wouldn't keep the wolves at bay. 2 months passed. The snow drifts piled high against the stone walls of Valerius Keep, turning the world into a brutal, monochromatic prison. I didn't leave. A cynical voice in my head told me to pack my weapons and ride south, to become a rogue. But the north was my home, and pride is a stubborn anchor. I refused to give Kaelin or Clara the satisfaction of seeing me chased away by my own heartbreak. Instead, I made myself indispensable in the dirtiest ways possible. I took over the hunting patrols entirely. I spent my days knee-deep in snow, tracking elk and hauling bloody carcasses back to the kitchens so the pack wouldn't starve. I smelled perpetually of raw meat, wet fur, and wood smoke. Clara, meanwhile, spent her days in the upper chambers, organizing midwinter festivals and selecting new tapestries for the Alpha's quarters. We existed in the same fortress, yet lived in entirely different realities. It was mid-afternoon, the sky a bruised purple, when Kaelin finally cornered me. I was in the courtyard, a heavy hunting knife in my hand, skinning a buck we had brought down that morning. The blood was hot, steaming in the freezing air, staining my hands crimson up to the wrists. Maeve. I didn't look up. I kept the blade moving, sliding it smoothly between the hide and the muscle. My king. His boots crunched on the packed snow as he stepped closer. He smelled of rich incense and expensive oils. Clara's influence. The scent made my stomach turn. "You're working too hard," he said, his voice carrying that infuriating tone of forced authority. "The hunters can skin their own kills." "The hunters are exhausted, Kaelin," I replied, ripping a section of hide free with a sharp tug. "And the pack needs to eat, unless Clara's new silk drapes are edible." He sighed, a heavy, impatient sound. "Do not speak of your Luna that way. I came down here to talk to you, Maeve, to make you understand." I drove the knife into the wooden block beside the carcass. It sank an inch deep with a heavy thunk. I wiped my bloody hands on a rag and finally looked at him. He looked tired. The crown was heavy, And a pretty wife didn't make the winter any less brutal. Understand what? I asked, my voice flat. That you needed a political advantage? That she looks better sitting in the high chair than I do? I understand perfectly, Kaelin. I just don't care. It wasn't just politics, he said, taking a step closer, his voice dropping. It was instinct, a pull. When she returned, something shifted. I had to choose what was best for the future of the bloodline. She's fertile, Maeve. She's strong in ways that matter for a Luna. I laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. Fertile, right. And I'm just the attack dog you keep in the yard. Don't dress your lust up as duty, Alpha. It's insulting to both of us. His eyes flashed with anger, his wolf rising to the surface, demanding submission. I didn't drop my gaze. I wasn't his mate, and I owed him no subservience outside of the battlefield. Before he could issue a command, a sharp, frantic blast from the watchtower horn shattered the quiet. One long blast, followed by two short ones. Intruders. At the western gate. Kaelin's demeanor shifted instantly from guilty ex-lover to Alpha King. He turned, sprinting toward the heavy iron gates as the heavy crossbars were thrown back by the guards. I grabbed my hunting knife, ignoring the blood, and followed right behind him. A patrol of our border guards rode through the opening. They looked battered. Two of them were bleeding, slumped over their saddles. In the center of the formation, dragging behind a horse on heavy iron chains, was a man. No, not a man. A beast in human skin. He dropped to his knees as the horse stopped, the chains clanking heavily against the frozen cobblestones. He was stripped to the waist despite the freezing temperature. His torso was a map of brutal, jagged scars, some old and silvered, others raw and angry. He was massive, taller and broader than Kaelin, radiating a dark, suffocating heat that melted the snow beneath his bare knees. Black hair fell in matted, bloody ropes over his face. "What is this?" Kaelin demanded, stepping forward. "Found him crossing the bloodline, Alpha," the lead guard gasped, holding his side where a dark stain was spreading through his tunic. "He didn't shift. He fought us in human form, took down 4 of our best before we managed to drug him and get the chains on." Kaelin sneered, drawing his own broadsword. "A rogue, a stupid one to wander into my territory in the dead of winter." The prisoner slowly lifted his head. The breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. It wasn't a gentle realization. It was violent. It felt like a hook had been driven under my ribs, attached to a chain, and pulled tight. My vision swam, the edges of the courtyard darkening until the only thing in focus was him. His eyes were a terrifying, unnatural shade of fractured silver. They were the eyes of a killer, hollowed out by violence and survival. But the moment those silver eyes locked onto mine, they dilated. A low, vibrating rumble started in his chest, a sound so deep I felt it in the marrow of my bones. The scent hit me then. It cut through the stench of Kaelin's incense, through the copper tang of the deer blood on my hands. It smelled of ozone right before a lightning strike. It smelled of crushed dark pine, petrichor, and pure, unfiltered power. Mine. The word didn't come from my brain. It came from my soul, a primal scream from the wolf inside me that had been dormant and suppressed for months. Kaelin raised his sword, stepping toward the chained man. "Let's see if this rogue bleeds like the rest." Before Kaelin could bring the blade down, the prisoner surged upwards. The heavy iron chains snapped tight, the metal groaning under an impossible strain. He didn't look at the king. He didn't look at the swords pointed at his throat. He kept his silver eyes locked entirely on me, and as the blood dripped from his chin, he smiled. It was a terrible, beautiful smile. The smile of a monster who had just found his treasure. My true mate hadn't come to save me. He had come to burn this place to the ground. The broadsword descended. I didn't think. I didn't weigh the political ramifications or the sheer insanity of stepping between an Alpha King and his execution block. My body moved entirely on instinct, driven by a violent magnetic pull that screamed at me to protect what was mine. I slammed my shoulder hard into Kaelin's chest. He wasn't expecting the impact. He stumbled back, his boots slipping on the bloody cobblestones. The heavy blade carved through the empty air, burying itself deep into the snow and packed earth right beside the prisoner's knee. A collective gasp sucked the air from the courtyard. The guards gripped their spears. Brutus, my hound, let out a sharp, confused bark from the kennels. Kaelin ripped his sword from the frozen dirt, his amber eyes blazing with sudden, unhinged fury. "Have you lost your mind, Maeve?" he roared, the sound vibrating with the authority of his wolf. "Step aside." I stood over the kneeling man. The heat radiating off his scarred back was unnatural, like standing next to a forge. I didn't look down at him. I kept my eyes locked on Kaelin, forcing my own aura outward, refusing to submit to his command. "Dead rogues tell no secrets, Kaelin," I said. My voice was eerily calm, betraying none of the chaos thrashing inside my ribs. He crossed the bloodline in human form. He took down 4 armed guards without shifting. "Look at him." I pointed a bloody finger at the prisoner. "He's not a starving scavenger. He's a soldier. And if he's here, he might not be alone." Kaelin's jaw tightened. He looked from me to the prisoner, then to the bleeding border guards slumped on their horses. The logic was sound. I was giving him a tactical reason to sheath his sword, hiding the frantic, terrifying truth pounding in my veins. "We need to know where he came from," I pressed, keeping my tone perfectly measured, the pragmatic general advising her king. "We need to know how he broke the perimeter. You execute him now. You blind us to whatever threat sent him." Kaelin stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. The silence was absolute. I could feel the eyes of the pack burning into my back. I could feel the prisoner's gaze burning into my calves. Finally, Kaelin lowered the sword. He spat a curse onto the snow. "Take him to the deep cells," Kaelin ordered the guards, his voice clipped and bitter. He pointed a finger at me. "You want answers from him, Maeve? You get them. You have 3 days. If he doesn't give you a staging ground or a pack name by then, I'll take his head myself. And I won't miss." He turned and marched toward the keep, his heavy bear fur mantle sweeping behind him. The courtyard exhaled. The guards yanked the heavy chains. The prisoner stood. He didn't stumble. He rose with a terrifying, coiled grace. As they dragged him past me, the heavy iron links clanking loudly. He turned his head. His silver eyes caught mine again. Up close, I could see the fracture lines in his irises, like shattered ice over a deep, dark lake. The scent of dark pine and ozone washed over me, thick and intoxicating. He didn't say a word. He just held my gaze until the guards forced him toward the armory doors leading to the subterranean levels. I stood in the snow until my hands stopped shaking. Then I went back to skinning the deer. I waited until midnight. The keep was quiet, swallowed by the freezing dark. I moved through the stone corridors silently, holding a flickering oil lantern and carrying a leather satchel. The stairs leading down to the deep cells were slick with dampness and black mold. The air down here smelled of rust, old blood, and despair. There was only one guard on duty, Hale, a young, broad-shouldered kid I had trained in knife fighting 2 winters ago. He jumped as I stepped into the dim light of the guard room. "Maeve, didn't hear you." "You wouldn't be much use if someone wanted you dead, Hale," I muttered, setting a heavy clay jug on his table. "Spiced wine, from the kitchen. It's freezing down here." He looked at the jug, then at the heavy iron keys on his belt. "The Alpha said no visitors. I'm not a visitor. I'm the interrogator, I replied, my voice hard. Unlock the door, Hale, and take a walk to the upper landing. The rogue smells like an abattoir, and I don't need you vomiting while I work. Hale hesitated, but obedience to me was ingrained in his bones. He took the key, walked down the narrow corridor, and unlocked the heavy, solid oak door at the very end. He didn't open it. He just backed away and took the jug of wine up the stairs. I stood before the door. My heart hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm against my sternum. I pushed the heavy wood open. The cell was pitch black, devoid of windows. The only light came from my lantern. It cast long, dancing shadows against the weeping stone walls. He was chained to the far wall. His wrists were secured in heavy iron cuffs, bolted to the stone, forcing his arms wide. He was sitting on the freezing floor, his head bowed. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The heavy metallic clack of the latch echoed loudly. I set the lantern on a small wooden stool. The light washed over him. The scars on his chest looked even more brutal in the yellow light. Blood from a gash on his temple had dried in a dark streak down his jaw. He didn't look up. "You're bleeding on my stone floor," I said softly. A low, vibrating hum resonated in the small space. It was a chuckle. It sounded like gravel grinding against steel. He slowly raised his head. The silver eyes caught the lantern light, glowing with an unnatural, predatory luminescence. "It's not your floor, little wolf," he rasped. His voice was ruined, thick with disuse and violence. "But I'll bleed wherever you ask me to." I didn't flinch at the nickname. I opened my leather satchel and pulled out a roll of clean bandages, a tin of healing salve, and a wrapped hunk of roasted venison. "I don't need your blood," I said, stepping closer. I kept my movements deliberate, predictable. You don't make sudden gestures around a cornered predator. "I need answers. Kalen will execute you in 3 days if I don't give him a reason to keep you breathing." He watched me approach. The chains clinked softly as he shifted his weight. Kalen. He tasted the name, spitting it out like spoiled meat. The boy with the heavy crown and the soft hands. He couldn't kill me if I handed him the blade. I knelt in front of him, close enough to feel the intense, suffocating heat radiating from his skin. Close enough that the mate bond flared in my chest, a violent, desperate ache urging me to press my hands against his chest, to bury my face in his neck. I ruthlessly shoved the instinct down into a dark box in my mind and locked it. I had learned the hard way that giving away your heart only leaves you bleeding. "He's the Alpha King," I corrected flatly, "and you are chained to his wall." I reached out and pressed a damp, clean cloth against the dried blood on his temple. He didn't pull away. His skin was burning up. "My name is Bram," he said quietly. I didn't ask. "You should know the name of the man you belong to." I stopped wiping. I met his silver gaze. The intensity in his eyes was staggering, stripping away my defenses, layer by layer. "I belong to myself," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "A mate bond is just biology. It's a chemical trick to ensure strong pups. It doesn't mean I trust you. It doesn't mean I want you. It just means the universe has a sick sense of humor." Bram's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. The silver turned to storm clouds. "Who hurt you, Maeve?" Hearing my name in his ruined, gravelly voice sent a shiver straight down my spine. I ignored the question. I smeared the pungent healing salve over his cut. "Where are you from, Bram? Give me a pack name. Give me a territory. Give me something I can feed the council tomorrow." "I have no pack," he stated smoothly. "I am the last of the Ironwood bloodline. I travel alone. A lone wolf taking down 4 trained guards in human form," I scoffed, tossing the bloody cloth aside. "Lie better. Kalen won't buy it, and neither do I. I didn't come here to fight guards, Bram murmured, leaning his head forward, closing the distance between us until our noses were inches apart. The scent of him was overwhelming, drowning out the rot of the dungeon. I caught a scent on the northern wind 3 weeks ago, a scent that dragged me across 2 mountain ranges and a frozen river. Pine needles and cold iron. He inhaled deeply, his eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. You smell like war, Maeve, and I am tired of fighting alone. My breath hitched. I hated how my body betrayed me, how my heart pounded in response to his words. I shoved a piece of the wrapped venison against his chest. Eat, I ordered sharply, standing up and putting distance between us. You need your strength if you're going to survive Kaelin's counsel. Before he could take the meat, the heavy oak door creaked open. I spun around, my hand instinctively dropping to the hunting knife at my belt. Clara stood in the doorway. She looked entirely out of place, a delicate porcelain doll dropped into a slaughterhouse. She wore a heavy cloak of white fox fur over a pale blue silk gown. She held a scented handkerchief over her nose, her eyes wide as she took in the damp walls, the rusty chains, and finally, the massive, scarred man chained to the wall. Maeve, she said, her voice muffled by the perfumed cloth. What are you doing down here? Kaelin is looking for you. My jaw clenched. Interrogating the prisoner, as I was ordered to. Clara stepped fully into the room, leaving the door ajar. She looked at the bandages and the meat on the floor, her delicate eyebrows raised. Interrogating? It looks like you're nursing him. Kaelin said he was a monster, a rabid dog. She took a step closer to Bram. She was playing the brave Luna, exercising her newly acquired power. It was pathetic. Stay back, Clara, I warned. She ignored me. She stopped a few feet from Bram, looking down at him with a mixture of disgust and haughty superiority. You will tell my sister what she wants to know, rogue, or I will have Kaelin take your tongue before he takes your head. Bram didn't move. He kept his head lowered, the black hair hiding his eyes. Did you hear me? Clara demanded, her voice shrill, lacking the deep, commanding resonance of a true alpha female. She reached out with the tip of her velvet slipper and nudged his knee. It happened faster than a blink. The heavy chains exploded with a deafening metallic screech. Bram lunged. He couldn't reach her, the chains snapping taut just inches from her dress. But the sheer, explosive violence of the movement was terrifying. A roar ripped from his throat. Not a human sound, but the guttural, chest-rattling snarl of a massive apex predator. The sound wave physically hit us, shaking the dust from the ceiling. Clara shrieked. She stumbled backward, tripping over the hem of her silk gown, and fell hard onto the filthy, damp stone floor. The scented handkerchief tumbled away. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her face entirely drained of blood, her eyes wide with primal, unfiltered terror. Bram settled back onto his haunches. The feral rage vanished from his face instantly, replaced by a cold, mocking smirk. He looked at Clara cowering on the ground, then shifted his silver gaze to me. Your Luna, Bram rasped, the amusement clear in his ruined voice. Smells like fear and cheap roses. You should teach her how to walk in the dark before she trips and breaks her neck. I looked down at my sister. The crown of hemlock was nowhere to be seen. In the dark, stripped of the great hall and the roaring crowd, she wasn't a queen. She was just a frightened girl in a dirty dress. Get out, Clara, I said quietly. She didn't argue. She scrambled to her feet, her hands blackened by the dungeon grime, and bolted through the open door, her frantic footsteps echoing up the stone stairs. I turned back to Bram. The silence settled heavily between us again. She'll tell Kaelin, I said, picking up my lantern. He'll call a council meeting at dawn. He won't wait 3 days now. Let him call his council, Bram said softly, his silver eyes tracking my every movement. I found what I was looking for. Now, I just have to break the chains. I didn't sleep. I returned to my quarters, a small, austere room near the barracks, and scrubbed the deer blood and dungeon grime from my skin with freezing water from the wash basin. The cold usually sharpened my thoughts. Tonight, it just made my bones ache. I sat on the edge of my narrow cot, staring at the scarred wooden floorboards. My chest felt hollowed out, yet impossibly heavy. The mate bond was a physical pressure, a tightening cord pulling me back down to the deep cells. It took every ounce of discipline I had spent years cultivating to stay in my room. I oiled my hunting knives. I restitched a tear in my leather tunic. I waited for the inevitable. The summons came just before dawn. 3 sharp raps on my wooden door. "Council chamber, Maeve," a gruff voice called out. It was Corin, one of the elder guards. "Alpha's orders." The keep was completely silent as I walked the stone corridors. The torches had burned down to smoking embers. When I pushed open the heavy doors to the council chamber, the sour stench of bruised egos and fear hit me before I even crossed the threshold. The room was circular, built around a massive, rough-hewn oak table. 6 of the pack elders sat in the high-backed chairs. They looked tired, their lined faces pulled taut in the grey morning light, filtering through the narrow arrow slits. Calen stood at the head of the table. He wasn't wearing his heavy fur mantle, just a simple leather gambeson. He looked like a soldier preparing for a skirmish, but the dark circles under his amber eyes betrayed his exhaustion. Clara sat to his right. She had changed her ruined silk gown for a modest, dark wool dress, but she had draped Calen's heavy winter cloak over her shoulders. She looked small, fragile, and perfectly victimized. She refused to look at me as I approached the table. "You brought a rogue into my keep, and you let him threaten your Luna," Calen started. No greeting. No formalities. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. I stopped a few feet from the table, crossing my arms over my chest. "I didn't bring him here, Calen. Your border patrol did. And he didn't threaten her. He rattled his chains because she poked him with her shoe like a caged sideshow attraction." Several elders shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "He lunged at me," Clara interrupted, her voice trembling perfectly. She looked at the elders, her wide, doe-like eyes brimming with unshed tears. "He tried to rip my throat out. If the chains hadn't held—" She trailed off, burying her face in her hands. It was a masterful performance. I would have applauded if the stakes weren't so high. He was testing the limits of his confinement, I said smoothly, keeping my voice devoid of emotion. It's what predators do. If she hadn't gone down to the deep cells, against your explicit orders, I might add, she wouldn't have been frightened. Calen slammed both hands flat on the oak table. The loud crack echoed off the stone walls. "Enough! You don't defend a rogue in this room, Maeve, especially not one who disrespects the crown." I met his gaze dead on. "I am defending logic. He is a soldier from an unknown pack, holding information we need to secure our borders before the deep freeze sets in. You kill him now because Clara had a scare in the dark, and you throw away our only tactical advantage." "He told you nothing," Calen shot back, his lip curling. "Hale reported you were down there for 20 minutes. You fed him. You bandaged him. You treated him like a guest." "I kept him alive so he could talk." "He won't talk," Calen growled. He pushed off the table, pacing slowly behind Clara's chair. His wolf was agitated, pacing just beneath his skin. "I went down there myself an hour ago. I demanded his pack name. I demanded to know how he breached the bloodline. I froze. My pulse spiked. And he laughed at me," Calen said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The humiliation radiating from him was palpable. An Alpha King does not get mocked in his own dungeon. "He sat in the filth and laughed. He is a rabid animal, Maeve. And we put down rabid animals before they infect the pack. Kalen stopped pacing. He looked at the elders. They nodded in silent agreement. The trial was over before I even walked in the door. Logic didn't matter here. Kalen's pride had been bruised twice in one night, once by a chained prisoner, and once by my refusal to submit to his narrative. "The execution is set for high noon," Kalen declared, his eyes locking onto mine. There was a cruel, vindictive spark in his amber gaze. He wanted to punish me. He wanted to remind me exactly who held the power. "And since you are so invested in his well-being, Maeve, you will be the one to bring him to the block." The air left my lungs. It was a calculated strike, forcing me to lead my own mate to the slaughter in front of the entire pack. It was designed to break my spirit entirely. I didn't blink. I didn't let the horror clawing at my throat show on my face. I gave him the same slow, mocking nod I had given him the night he crowned Clara. "As my king commands," I said quietly. I turned on my heel and walked out of the room, the heavy oak doors groaning shut behind me. By 11 o'clock, the courtyard was packed. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the air brittle and agonizingly clear. The winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the frosted flagstones. 400 wolves stood in a wide circle around the execution block, a massive, flat slab of ancient granite stained dark with generations of blood. They were silent. Executions in winter were grim affairs, a stark reminder of the harshness of our existence. I walked down the dark, damp stairs to the deep cells for the last time. My boots felt like lead. The heavy ring of keys in my hand clinked softly, a morbid countdown with every step. When I reached the bottom, Hale wasn't there. Kalen had cleared the guard room. He wanted me to do this alone. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pushed it open. Bram was exactly as I had left him, chained to the wall, sitting on the freezing stone. But the atmosphere in the cell had changed. The oppressive heat he radiated was gone. The air was unnervingly still. He lifted his head as I stepped inside, the silver eyes locked onto mine, piercing through the gloom. He didn't look like a man hours away from decapitation. He looked rested. "High noon?" he asked, his rough voice breaking the silence. "Yes," I replied. My voice was entirely flat. If I let any emotion seep into my tone, I would shatter completely. I walked over to him, holding the keys. "You look pale, little wolf." "Shut up, Bram." I knelt beside him, slotting the heavy iron key into the massive bolt securing his right wrist to the wall. I turned it with a hard wrench. The lock clicked. The bolt slid free. He didn't move his arm. He just watched my face. I moved to his left wrist, refusing to meet his gaze. I leaned over his lap to reach the bolt, my chest brushing against his bare, scarred shoulder. The physical contact sent a jolt of raw electricity straight down to my toes. I gasped softly, my hand fumbling the key. Suddenly, his large, calloused hand snapped up. He wrapped his fingers loosely around my wrist. I froze. He could snap my arm like a dry twig in a fraction of a second, but his grip wasn't violent. It was anchoring. His thumb brushed over my racing pulse point. "Do not mourn me today, Maeve," he murmured, his breath hot against my cheek. I finally looked at him. The fracture lines in his silver irises were shifting, expanding. "Kalen will take your head, Bram. I can't stop him." I tried. I know you tried. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. But Kalen's sword cannot cut what it cannot catch. When we reach the courtyard, stay behind me. When the blood starts flowing, do not step forward. "What are you planning?" I demanded, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "There are 400 wolves out there. You are one man in heavy chains." "I am an Ironwood," he said simply. He let go of my wrist. Take off the wall bolts. Leave the cuff chains. I didn't argue. I unlocked the left bolt. The heavy iron cuffs remained on his wrists, connected by a thick 2-foot length of heavy chain. It was enough for him to walk, but not enough to throw a punch. He stood up. The sheer size of him in the confined space was overwhelming. He stretched his neck, the joints popping loudly in the damp air. "Lead the way," he said. We walked up the stairs in silence. The heavy clanking of his chains echoed off the stone walls. As we reached the ground floor and stepped out into the blinding white light of the courtyard, the pack let out a collective, low murmur. The sea of wolves parted for us. I walked 10 paces ahead of him, staring straight at the granite block. Kalen stood behind it, wearing his heavy bear fur mantle again, his broad sword resting point down in the snow. Clara stood on a raised wooden platform to his left, surrounded by 4 heavily armed guards. She looked terrified, clutching the wooden railing with white-knuckled fingers. I stopped 10 feet from the block. Bram stopped behind me. "Bring him to the stone," Kalen commanded, his voice carrying easily over the silent courtyard. I didn't move. I turned around and looked at Bram. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. He stepped forward, walking past me. The chains dragged heavily through the snow. He didn't look at the execution block. He didn't look at Kalen. He stopped right in front of the granite slab and slowly sank to his knees. Kalen stepped forward, gripping the hilt of his broadsword with both hands. He looked down at Bram with utter contempt. "You crossed the bloodline of the Northern Marches," Kalen announced, his voice booming. "You threatened the Lunar of this pack. By the ancient laws of our kind, the penalty for a rogue is death." Bram bowed his head, his black hair falling over his face, exposing the thick, scarred muscles of his neck. Kalen raised the broadsword high above his head. The sunlight caught the polished steel, flashing blindingly. "For the safety of the pack," Kalen roared. The blade began its descent. Bram didn't flinch. Instead, he slammed his chained wrists onto the granite block with bone-shattering force. A horrifying sound ripped through the courtyard. The sickening crack of dislocating joints. Bram forcibly dislocated both of his own thumbs, folding them inward. With a violent, twisting jerk, he ripped his massive hands backward out of the tight iron cuffs. Flesh tore, blood sprayed across the grey stone, but he was free. The broadsword was halfway down. Bram surged upward from his knees. He didn't try to block the blade. He stepped inside Kalen's swing, his bleeding hand shooting out and wrapping around Kalen's throat like a steel vice. The sword clattered uselessly against the granite block. Kalen gagged, his amber eyes bulging in shock. Bram lifted the Alpha King off the ground entirely by his neck. A collective scream erupted from the pack. The courtyard exploded into chaos. Guards drew their weapons, but they froze. Bram held their king suspended in the air, his silver eyes burning with a terrifying ancient fury. "I am no rogue," Bram roared. The sound wasn't human. It was a shockwave that dropped half the pack to their knees in pure, instinctual submission. "I am the Alpha of the Ironwood territory, and I have come to collect what is mine." The courtyard fractured. The sheer, suffocating weight of Bram's aura slammed into the enclosed space like a physical avalanche. It wasn't the trained, controlled dominance Kalen used to keep the council in line. This was ancient. It was the raw, untamed pressure of an apex predator, demanding absolute, biological obedience. Wolves who had been screaming for blood a second ago collapsed. Hardened guards dropped their spears, their knees hitting the frozen flagstones as they instinctively bared their necks. The air grew so thick with power, it tasted like copper and ozone. I didn't fall. The oppressive wave of dominance hit me, but instead of crushing my spine, it wrapped around me. It felt like a heavy, protective cloak. My wolf, dormant and cynical for months, rose up in my chest and purred. Bram held Kalen suspended by his throat. Kalen's heavy boots kicked uselessly at the empty air. His face was turning a mottled, unnatural purple. His hands tore desperately at the massive, bloody forearm locking his windpipe, but he might as well have been clawing at solid rock. "Kill him!" Clara shrieked from the wooden platform. Her voice was shrill, entirely devoid of the Luna's authority. She pointed a trembling, pale finger at Bram. "Guards! Shoot him! Cut him down!" None of the 4 guards flanking her moved. Their eyes were wide, fixed on the floor, their bodies completely paralyzed by the Ironwood Alpha's command. Bram didn't even look at her. His silver eyes remained locked on the choking king. Blood dripped steadily from his mangled, dislocated thumbs, splashing hot and red against Kaelin's pristine, leather gambeson. "You call yourself a king," Bram rasped, his voice cutting cleanly through the horrific silence of the courtyard. "You hide behind stone walls and dress a frightened child in a hemlock crown. You don't know what winter really is." With a sudden, dismissive flick of his wrist, Bram let go. Kaelin crashed to the granite block, sliding off the slick stone and hitting the snow-packed earth on his hands and knees. He violently retched, gasping for air, clutching his bruised throat. The great Alpha of the northern marches, coughing up bile at the feet of a chained prisoner. The humiliation was absolute. I watched Kaelin struggle to his feet, swaying heavily. The bearskin mantle looked entirely ridiculous on him now. It was the skin of a beast he had killed with a spear, not with his bare hands. He looked up at Bram, his amber eyes wide with a mixture of raw terror and disbelief. "Ironwood!" Kaelin choked out, spitting blood onto the snow. "The Ironwood pack was wiped out, slaughtered by the Southern Rogues 50 years ago. You are a ghost." Bram stepped down from the execution block. The heavy chains trailing from his cuffs dragged across the stone. He didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a nightmare made of muscle and scars. "The pack burned," Bram corrected quietly, his fractured silver eyes darkening. "But the bloodline survived in the deep freeze. We learned to hunt in the dark. We learned to survive without the comfort of fires and high walls. I let your border guards capture me, Kaelin. I let you chain me to your rotting wall. I wanted to see the man who claimed the North." Bram stopped a few feet from me. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the cowering pack, over the terrified elders, over Clara weeping on the platform. Finally, he looked at Kaelin. "I found a coward," Bram stated. Kaelin's lips peeled back in a desperate snarl. His pride was fatally wounded, bleeding out on the snow. He reached blindly for the broadsword resting on the granite slab. "You come into my home. You mock my reign." "I don't care about your reign," Bram interrupted. He stepped past the king. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, ignoring the collective gasp of the remaining conscious wolves. He stopped directly in front of me. The heat rolling off his skin fought back the winter chill. He raised his mangled, bleeding hands and gently cupped my face. He didn't care about his torn flesh. He only cared about the contact. "I came for her," Bram said. His ruined voice carried across the dead-silent courtyard. "I crossed the ice to find my mate." Kaelin froze. His hand hovered inches from the hilt of his sword. He stared at us, his jaw slack, the bruised skin of his throat stark against his sudden pallor. He looked from Bram's towering, brutal frame to me. "Maeve," Kaelin whispered. The word barely carried. I didn't look at Kaelin. I kept my eyes locked on Bram. The fracture lines in his silver irises were completely gone, replaced by a solid, burning intensity. The mate bond I had ruthlessly suppressed snapped violently into place. It wasn't a sweet, romantic click. It was the heavy slam of a steel vault locking shut. "He's lying!" Clara cried out, clinging to the wooden railing. "She's just a soldier. She doesn't have a mate." I finally turned my head. I looked at my sister, huddled in her stolen furs, clutching at a crown that was already slipping. Then I looked at Kaelin, the king who had traded loyalty for a pretty smile. "He's not lying," I said. My voice was calm, but it carried the cold, unforgiving edge of a winter storm. He is my true mate. And you, Kaelin, just tried to cut off his head. Kaelin's reaction was not one of graceful defeat. It was the desperate, explosive panic of a man watching his entire foundation crumble. No. Kaelin grabbed the broadsword from the block. His hands were shaking, but his wolf surged forward, driving him with blind, possessive fury. She belongs to this pack. She is my general. She swore an oath to the northern marches. I swore an oath to a leader who understood sacrifice. I shot back, stepping out from behind Bram's massive frame. I didn't reach for my knives. I didn't need them. You broke that oath the night you put the hemlock on her head. You chose the soft path, Kaelin. You chose a decorative wife while I bled in the snow to keep your people fed. I owe you nothing. Kaelin lunged. He didn't swing the heavy sword at me. He aimed a brutal, horizontal cleave straight for Bram's unprotected ribcage. It was a cowardly strike, fueled by desperation and bruised ego. Bram didn't even shift his stance. He just reached out. His massive, bloody hand clamped down on the flat of the broadsword mid-swing. The thick steel groaned under the sudden, impossible pressure. The sharp edge bit into Bram's palm, adding more blood to the grisly mess of his torn flesh. But he didn't flinch. With a sickening wrench, Bram twisted his wrist. The heavy steel snapped. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. Kaelin stumbled forward, holding nothing but a jagged hilt and 6 inches of broken metal. Before Kaelin could recover, Bram's boot lashed out, burying itself deep into Kaelin's chest. The king was lifted entirely off his feet. He flew backward, crashing hard into the packed snow, 10 feet away. He didn't get back up immediately. He lay there, wheezing, clutching his fractured ribs. The courtyard was dead silent. The undisputed king of the north had just been dismantled in less than 10 seconds by a man still wearing dungeon irons. You keep talking about oaths and borders, Bram said softly, dropping the broken upper half of the broadsword onto the granite block. The metal rang dully against the stone. But you don't understand the first rule of the Wild Boy. You keep what you can protect. And you couldn't protect a damn thing. I stepped forward. I reached up and took the clasp of my dark wool cloak. With a sharp tug, I pulled it free. The heavy garment fell to the frozen dirt, revealing the worn, blood-stained leather armor beneath. I am formally severing my bond to the Valerius pack, I declared. The words tasted like ash, but they had to be spoken. The moment the sentence left my lips, a sharp, searing pain ripped through my chest. It was the psychic tearing of a tie I had held since birth. Several wolves in the crowd whimpered, feeling the echo of the severed connection. I gritted my teeth and rode out the pain. I refused to let Kaelin see me bleed for him one last time. I walked over to Bram. I didn't hesitate. I reached out and took his ruined, bleeding hands in mine. The torn flesh around his dislocated thumbs was gruesome, the iron cuffs still dangling heavily from his wrists. I drew my hunting knife. I sliced 2 long, thick strips of fabric from the hem of my discarded cloak. Working quickly, efficiently, I bound his mangled hands, wrapping the dark wool tight to stem the bleeding. He stood perfectly still, letting me work. He didn't wince. He just watched my face. "You're making a mistake, Maeve." Clara's voice was barely a whisper now, echoing from the platform. She looked down at me, her eyes wide, with a sudden, dawning realization of what my departure truly meant. Without me, there was no one to hunt. No one to plan the patrols. No one to hold the line when the rogues came. I tied the last knot securely over Bram's left wrist. I didn't look at her. "You wanted the crown, Clara," I said coldly. "Enjoy the winter." I turned my back on my sister, my former king, and the pack I had bled for. I looked up at Bram. "Are we done here?" Bram's silver eyes softened. a stark contrast to the absolute violence he had just unleashed. He raised one of his heavily bandaged hands and gently touched the side of my neck, his thumb brushing over my racing pulse. "We can burn it to the ground, little wolf," he offered, his voice a low, gravelly promise. "Say the word, and I will tear these walls apart, stone by stone." I looked around the courtyard. I looked at the cowering wolves, the broken broadsword, Kaelin spitting blood into the snow, and Clara shivering in her silks. This place was already dead. Kaelin's pride had killed it long before Bram arrived. "No," I said. I felt the absolute certainty settle in my bones. "Let them rot in their own cage. I prefer the open air." Bram smiled. It was that same terrible, beautiful smile from the courtyard yesterday. But this time, it was entirely for me. "Then we walk," he said. He didn't bother demanding horses or supplies. He simply turned and walked toward the heavy open gates of the keep, the heavy chains dragging behind him, scoring deep tracks into the pristine snow. I walked right beside him. The crowd parted silently, creating a wide avenue for us to leave. No one raised a spear. No one spoke a word of challenge. They simply watched the true monsters walk out of their fortress, taking their last hope of survival with them. The heavy timber gates of Valerius Keep slammed shut behind us. The thud echoed off the valley walls, a definitive period at the end of my past. We didn't look back. We just kept walking into the tree line. The winter wind bit immediately through my leather tunic, stripping away the lingering heat of the courtyard. I shivered, pulling my arms close to my chest. I had left my heavy wool cloak in the snow. A stupid, dramatic gesture, perhaps, but it felt necessary. A sharp bark broke the silence. I turned to see Brutus, my massive hunting hound, barreling through the snowdrifts. He had jumped the kennel fencing. He slid to a halt at my feet, his tail wagging a slow, uncertain rhythm as he eyed the giant man beside me. Bram looked down at the dog. He didn't tense. He extended one of his bandaged hands. Brutus sniffed the bloody wool, let out a low whine, and pressed his heavy head against Bram's knuckles. "Good boy," Bram rasped. He looked at me, his silver eyes crinkling at the corners. "At least you didn't leave all your loyalty behind." We walked for 3 hours. The silence between us wasn't strained. It was the companionable quiet of two predators navigating the wilderness. We crossed the frozen Blackwater River, the ice groaning under Bram's massive weight. When the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and violent orange, we found shelter in a shallow cave system I used during deep winter tracking. I gathered dry pine needles and deadwood. Within minutes, I had a small, hot fire crackling against the stone wall. Bram sat heavily by the flames. He looked exhausted. The adrenaline that had fueled his explosive display in the courtyard was fading, leaving behind the brutal reality of his injuries. The dungeon dampness clung to his skin, and the iron cuffs still hung from his wrists. "Give me your hands," I said, kneeling beside him. I pulled a set of iron lockpicks from my boot. Kaelin never knew I carried them. I spent 10 minutes working the primitive mechanisms of the cuffs. With a heavy clack, the left one sprang open. The right followed shortly after. I tossed the heavy, bloody iron into the far corner of the cave. The sound of metal hitting stone felt incredibly satisfying. I unwrapped the makeshift bandages. The damage was severe. The skin was stripped raw, the flesh torn deeply around the base of his thumbs where he had forced the joints out of their sockets. "Hold still," I muttered. I gripped his massive left hand. I placed my thumb over his dislocated joint, applying steady, agonizing pressure. Bram didn't make a sound. He didn't even clench his jaw. I pushed hard, snapping the bone back into place with a wet, heavy crunch. He let out a long, slow breath. "You have a heavy touch, Maeve." You ripped your own hands apart to avoid a beheading, I shot back, moving to his right hand and repeating the process. Crack. I think you can handle it. I cleaned his wounds with melted snow and packed them with the remaining salve from my satchel. He watched me the entire time. The mate bond, untethered by the presence of my former pack, flooded the small cave. It wasn't a frantic, desperate pull anymore. It was a deep, resonating hum, an anchor holding me steady in the freezing dark. "Why did you come for me?" I asked quietly, tying off the last bandage. "You didn't know me. You just caught a scent on the wind." Bram leaned back against the cave wall. The firelight cast harsh, flickering shadows across the map of scars on his chest. An Ironwood does not ignore the call of their mate. My pack was slaughtered because they grew complacent, because they stopped listening to the wild. I survived because I didn't make that mistake. He reached out, his bandaged hand catching a loose strand of my dark hair. He tucked it behind my ear. The brush of his rough knuckles against my cold skin sent a jolt of heat straight to my core. "I knew what you were the moment I smelled you," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating rumble that made Brutus thump his tail in his sleep. "A survivor. A fighter forced to play the obedient hound. I didn't come to rescue you, Maeve. You didn't need rescuing. I came to stand beside you." I looked into his fractured silver eyes. For 3 years I had stood beside a king who only saw my utility, a man who weighed my worth against the political advantage of a pretty face. Now, I sat in a freezing cave with a scarred, bloody rogue who had broken his own bones just to prove I wasn't alone. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just leaned forward and pressed my forehead against his shoulder. The heat radiating from him soaked into my freezing bones. He wrapped his massive, heavy arms around me, pulling me flush against his chest. He smelled of pine, ozone, and dried blood. It was the best thing I had ever smelled. "Tomorrow, we head north," Bram said softly into my hair. "Beyond the bloodline. The Ironwood territory is harsh, Maeve. No high stone walls, no silk dresses." "Good," I whispered, closing my eyes. I always hated silk, anyway. And that concludes the epic tale of Maeve and Bram. The Alpha King learned the hard way that you cannot cage a true warrior, and a hemlock crown offers no warmth when the real winter arrives. If you loved this deeply grounded, gritty werewolf romance, hit that like button and share this story with your pack. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on our dark fantasy narratives. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Maeve's place? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.